how you should reduce your emissions and kind of just like follow our path, because even though China is the leading emitter of carbon emissions, we are reducing by 8% our total consumption, and we already have reduced it by 8% due to 1,000 coal mines being closed. 20% of our energy sources will be zero emission by 2030, and I think it'd be smart for you to tax carbon and fossil fuels, kind of like you're planning on doing by 2050, kind of like doubling the taxes on those, and yeah, that's it.
I think we would be open to that. However, I think our economies are also very different.
Yeah.
And that seems like a big number. Like, I think we're willing to like look into taxing carbon and all sorts of other things. But how have you guys like started to implement that plan? Like, how would you suggest that we follow in your footsteps, I guess?
Just like investing in more renewable sources and like nuclear.
India's already started to look into that. They have a really big solar energy movement going, and would like to expand to wind energy as well. So I think renewable energy is something we're very interested in, and we are looking to expand that, and hopefully that will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions.
The way that India is kind of approaching is because we have such a fast-growing population, and with that goes hand in hand with an increase in energy demand. And I think why we're hesitant to start, like, to put a cap, I think also is because we're aiming to address this growing energy demand by investing in renewable technology. So as these rural communities start to go on the grid, we're trying to provide them with renewable electricity. So that's kind of where our stance is coming from.
Yeah.
Also, I think in terms of like China lowering theirs by like 8%, it's still higher than India's emission. So I don't know how much you want.
Well, that 8% was in 4 months also.
Yeah, it's
It was
been
8%
down
in
really,
4
really
months.
fast.
Will that be continued?
Yeah.
Yes, by 20.
The decline is accelerating.
I think they said they want to peak their carbon emissions by like 2030 because there's not much you can do in the short term. But
Yeah.
from then on, they're like planning on significantly reducing. Like they're already reducing.
Are
They're
they investing in
up
the
until now.
infrastructure to do that?
Oh, they already have.
We have a lot of funding for
Yeah.
that. Would you guys be willing to be more transparent with India regarding these innovations in not just infrastructure, but like I mentioned earlier, water or anything else regarding climate change?
Like more transparent as compared to.
Like what? How are we
What
not
else?
being true?
Well,
Maybe share more of your policies and maybe like have people come in and help the government like establish the same things, if that's what you're suggesting that we do.
Sure, we could do that.
We could do that. We have,
can I go
Yeah.
to the next point? A priority about calling on developed nations to invest in India, because we think that's really important, but we do have some conditions for that. We expect that it would be beneficial for you guys to want us to fund in you, especially in transportation and your infrastructure on increasing renewable energy. But in return for this investment, we would like more support for our damming the Brahmaputra River. Brahmaputra, I can't say it very well, sorry. Any
I
thoughts?
think in that, India would like some of the power generated from that dam.
Also, probably a
Sharing
similar treaty
power.
that we have with other countries like Pakistan to ensure that we have reliable sourcing no matter no matter what tensions are.
Yeah, because
political
India-China
tensions.
tensions are very common. So I would like that not to affect.
Water
Yeah.
reliability for our
We're
country.
trying to
No,
go
it
for a
won't
more
affect water
gentle-
reliability for you in India. See, the Brahmaputra River is braided, so it will not affect the downstream for you guys. Okay, but we will build 4 dams in that river in order to provide electricity to the 100 million people that do not have it in China.
it's a big priority for us because
Yes.
there's such a huge water scarcity in the northern parts of China. So that's something that's really important to us. We really rely on damming this river.
I think India would be open to negotiation about a percentage of the power generated from the river, maybe along the lines of 30 or 40%.
That's pretty steep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I was gonna say, like,
But
That
it's
is a
also
lot.
4 dams and a lot of money.
Can I ask where
But
like
money
geographically
invested by China.
Wait, can I say
these
one
dams would
thing
be
Yeah, but
about
in order
that?
to build it, you'd
India?
have to have money invested from India too. So
You
I
guys
would-
have the potential
Towards
to have like 100,000 megawatts of energy, like from hydroelectricity, and you only use 3%. You have 37 rivers. So like, I don't know how much of our hydroelectricity you need if we're just building 4 dams and you have the potential
Well,
to
we
build
also
so
don't
many.
have, don't necessarily have the money to just go around building a bunch of dams either.
Resources.
Well, you definitely have our support in terms of we want to talk to developing nations about investing in India's infrastructure, and we're also willing to contribute to that as well. But as a condition of that, we really rely on damming up this river, so that's something that.
That's something we would consider.
Also look into like the geographical things, know where they're placed.
Yeah, where would you place them?
In
They would be in China.
in China, of course.
They- yeah, we wouldn't go
Yacha,
into-
Yuri-
But how much would that
Yacha.
limit the water that's going into India?
It won't limit it
And
But-
then
because it's a
It has
braided,
to.
it's a braided river. It will not have.
A negligible effect.
Uh-huh.
How
Really?
would? Yeah,
It's like
I don't
greenhouse.
believe that.
Well, research
Research conducted that
On
says.
the braided river?
What?
On the braided river, yes.
Well, I think we're open to looking into more research on the effects, but we plan on having a
will.
minimal.
I think that they're already in
assessment.
Right now there's no impact studies on that yet, so I don't know if you can.
Well, conducted
Say
by
that
the
yet?
Chinese government.
Yeah.
Yeah, right now
It's promising.
it was just a couple days ago that we called for India called for an impact study on these dams, so there's no information yet of the effects.
We'll get back to it.
Also,
So I think, yeah.
in addition to dams, we were kind of looking for affirmative action for women, and like, instead of like an 8-year compulsory education program, we were looking for more like a, kind of like America till age 16, just to like kind of make it even for women and men. And then, kind of like higher education quotas in colleges for women.
This would be applied to India and SARC and also for
Oh, you
us.
want us to?
Yeah.
I think we would agree with that, but it's
Yeah.
just, it's so much easier said than done. I also think it's.
Especially in a place like
hypocritical for
China
to
with a
suggest that.
communist.
I mean, that's definitely one of our
Government.
priorities. Education is a priority for
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
And we have been speaking with other teams to figure out how to fund that.
I think where that starts that's a pretty lengthy process. What it starts with is lower education.
Yeah, definitely. That's why we
Like
want
you have to start at the roots rather than just attacking affirmative action.
That's
That's
why
why
we.
Yeah, that's what it
recommend
says,
more
like,
Oh,
compulsory
okay.
plan.
I just got from what you said, like affirmative action at the college level, so.
Oh, no.
No,
it's
yeah, we
like
want to
ages.
start with the primary school. So affirmative action regarding females.
So that kind of like
Yeah,
attacks the
so-
like the fundamental issue of like the girls and boys who are like the discrepancy there, but then in college it's just so much more because of the initial conditions of like the
Like,
girls
if we-
dropping off.
Like you guys said, I think if we start with primary, I think you'll see the overflow into higher education, so I feel like primary education should be our primary.
Yeah.
We,
Yeah.
Yeah,
we just want to make
definitely.
sure, because what happens now is even if, like female children go into the primary school system, some will complete the compulsory and then some don't get away with it, and then that has long-lasting effects. But by implementing affirmative action at a higher education level, we're making sure that once you're past 16, parents won't just kind of pull girls and say, well, you're done with your education, let's go get married.
Yeah. I also don't think it's
Um,
just women, they do that with boys too.
One
So
minute
18%
Also on the
graduate.
topic
Okay.
of dams, because that's kind of a big thing you guys are pushing. The dams you're suggesting divert the water from northern India. Just,
We,
We,
no, so that's a huge effect.
Yeah, we acknowledge that.
No, you said that there would be no effect to India, like water supply, that would have a huge effect because it's diverted away from India.
Well,
So
the
I don't
problem
think
is
we'd be in
that,
support of that at all.
okay, but the problem is that, there's a huge portion of China that has no access to water, so a priority for us as a nation.
Well, we have
Yeah,
the
but
same
then,
priority.
yeah, but taking away, I don't see China's priority of having water for those means taking away from India citizens.
But, well, so yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying, but I'm just saying that as a nation, it's a priority for us to provide water to our citizens. I understand that that's a priority for you guys internally. We are willing to invest in infrastructure for your nation.
Yeah, but
That
you
was
need,
a
you
lot
need water
displacing a lot
to,
of
you need water to.
We're not saying that we're gonna take.
No, but that's what the
all of
dams
it
do.
either.
No, the dams divert it from the Himalayas. That's the
So I
current
mean,
plan.
we're dependent, we're like answering for our stakeholders. So they would not be happy with us agreeing to that, so we can't agree to
Yeah.
divert the water from Northern India.
Thanks so much.
We have a point of contention.
We'll have to end these negotiations, but if you, China, could head to dig in and Kara, you guys from India can go to Kara.
Where is Nikin?
Nikin is outside also.
After that's done, we're going to have reflection led by Dr. Iacono. Any questions? Okay, great. So first up is China.
Remember your assignments. The nature of the assignments as part of this module stays the same as for the last one. Okay? So we are going to have a panel summary. Nikhil, you are in charge of that. Each of the teams you are going to add on to that. They're going to help in that summary, but then you are going to add on to that.
It's right there.
Detailed thoughts, which includes expositions or elaborations on that summary, as well as any dissent you might have expressed in a civil way. And then we'll have your reflections across the entire thing, including your own journey as you learn these things on your own in your own sector or your region or entity. And then as you move through the teams and the negotiations, the work inside. So everything else stays the same.
Maybe I'll have 5 minutes for your presentation, just to let you know we have a minute left.
Okay. All right, just gonna start. So, can everyone see the board? Am I standing in the way? No, we're good. All right, so I'm China, and I'm representing Team China, along with Nick, Alina, Pedro, and Kat. And so for our proposed policies following the negotiations, we have basically 4 main incentives. The first one is to improve the economy and reduce the Gini coefficient of India, SAARC, and China. And this will be done through improving education, especially for women. The specifics of these plans I will get into in one of our later initiatives. The second is a call on developed nations to reduce their emissions. And we understand that China does produce a lot of emissions, and we're not going to shy away from that. But we are also doing a lot of work already to reduce emissions through things such as closing coal mines. We've closed 1,000 coal mines, and because of that, our coal consumption is down to 8%. And there's lots of other data that you can read on the board, but one that I really want to highlight is that we have the largest reduction of carbon emissions by any single country recorded in history. So our carbon dioxide emissions are down 5% from last year, and we did this in 4 months, and it's the largest large reduction in recorded history. So we are making progress, and we look forward to continuing that progress. So our third initiative is a call on developed nations to invest in India and SAARC, specifically investing in transportation infrastructure, renewable energy sources, and sustainable development. And we as China will also, plan on investing in India and SAARC, but with the following stipulations. The first one being an education reform for women. So basically we want to implement an affirmative action plan for women, kind of modeled after the one in place in the United States, but not exactly, a better version of it, which will include higher education quotas and a compulsory education system until the age of 16, much like the one in the United States. And we understand that, or we want this education system to kind of take off from the base, so from primary schooling, because that's where you'll have the greatest effect in reducing the education and gender gap between men and women. And then we would also like to build some dams on the Brahmaputra River. We want to build 4, and we already have 1 built, so that one's not really a source of contention because it's already built. So we want support on the next 3 dams. And then the 4th initiative is a U.S. debt payment plan. So currently the United States owes us $1.27 trillion, and we kind of want that money back. We need that capital to further develop sustainable energy practices for South Asia and China. Because, like I said before, we do produce a lot of emissions, but in order to further reduce our emissions and develop more sustainable energy practices, we do need more capital, which should come from the U.S.'s large debt to China. And then, as an incentive, I guess, to pay us back a little bit faster than the current rate, we will concede 5% of that debt if the United States takes that 5% and puts it into sustainable energy practices for the United States that
if implemented correctly and if success comes out of that, can be implemented throughout the rest of the world. So, yep, thank you very much. I'll leave this there.
Good job.
What should I click? Slideshow.
Hi. Oh, can everybody see? Can you guys see? Okay. My name is Joanna, and I'm representing the United Nations. I'm just going to talk about. We met with each of the four other the delegates from the 4 other groups, and I'm just going to outline what we discussed with each of them and what our new goals are moving forward in discussions. So we first met with India, and the UN wants to stress that we really support India in their drive for becoming a more sustainable and developed nation, and we understand that it's hard to move towards sustainable practices when you're developing. So we talked about India's procurement of more funds from the different G7 nations to help them with that goal. We talked about the Green Climate Fund in particular, along with other UN programs that we would like to see money go towards India to use for different purposes such as adaptation and mitigation, things that'll get them to become a more sustainable economy, which will also help them to use more of their own money to focus on educational improvements and things that will help them develop as they move forward. We also talked about working with other developed nations, such as Germany in particular, who has had a lot of success with moving towards sustainability. So we talked about working with these developed nations, coming into India and opening up dialogues to help them and serve as examples on what exactly needs to be done to become more sustainable while still maintaining development. We also lastly discussed expanding the US-India dialogue and using India as sort of a model for other nations who are looking to become more sustainable with the help of a more developed nation, and expanding that so that more countries are involved. Next, the UN discussed with SARC. We talked initially about the Bali Action Plan and the Cancun Agreement and how many countries have not yet submitted their mitigation plans, and we talked about definitely supporting pressure to these nations so that they will outline actual mitigation plans to be submitted at the Paris talks in 2015. We also talked about opening up dialogues between developed and developing nations, such as SARC, where there can be increased research funding for sustainable practices, helping these developing nations better increase their sustainability and energy practices. Next, we talked about potential consequences for failure to meet reduction goals, because the UN can't solely enforce things. We talked about maybe a group system of checks and balances so that different nations within each other could potentially, we could support different sanctions if nations were to not meet their goals. We also talked about a per capita cap and trade program for all nations, so that would depend on, it would be a sliding scale depending on the level of development of the nation. We then met with China, where we also discussed this curve cap and trade program that would differ based on who the country was and what their level of development was. We also talked about a policy initiative for investment in education, where China agreed to invest in education, and wanted funding from other developed nations also, which would develop a compulsory education system in nations such as India and the SARC countries, so that there would be an affirmative action plan for gender equality and give quotas for women in education. We also discussed increased transparency when it comes to emissions. We talked about China in particular, but also expanding this transparency worldwide to make sure that all countries are cooperating. So, that's the end. Thank you. Of development. We talked about increasing international aid from the U.S. along with other developed nations and using the U.S. as a kind of a lead in those dialogues so that the U.S. and the G7s could help the developing nations develop more sustainable practices. We talked about the UNDP in particular. The U.S. agreed to support the UNDP and help fund it so that countries such as India could receive help in development. We also discussed a set timeline and level of disbursement so that there was a more concrete way of administering this aid. And lastly, we talked about the U.S. leading talks with G7s to help give support to India and other nations in SAARC so that they have a more developed nation to look to as an example and receive support from in their process of developing sustainably. Thank you.
In the US and everybody else would like to copy that.
We didn't say that. We said that US has a plan in place, so we took an idea.
Which China would want India to follow. That's very interesting.
Yes, that's South Asia in general for the development of South Asian economies.
There was one other comment here.
The international press would also like to make a comment that there is no affirmative action in the United States.
I mean, in the university system, there are quotas in place.
No, there are not.
No, there's
There
not.
cannot be quotas.
I mean, not quotas, they're, what's the word?
Not anymore, I think.
There's no incentives.
There's
What's the
no
word?
such affirmative action in the United States.
All right, we're gonna back on that. It also would be nice
This
to
is
not get
international,
back
US
on.
is beyond the US.
Okay, hi, I'm Joyce, and then that's my team over there. You guys already know them. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about what we talked about with all of the other groups as Team India. So first thing, as Joanna pointed out, we're going to seek support from the UN Green Climate Fund. We're going to use this money to adopt technologies with lower emissions while using domestic funds to improve our education systems. And then we also talked with China about this affirmative action type situation where females are going to seek priority, specifically in the primary level of education. And then the UN said they will support international sharing of know-how in order to stimulate sustainability, specifically regarding transition from the majority informal sector of our economy to a more formal sector. And then we agreed with the US and UN regarding a cap and trade with support from US and G7 countries. We agree on a cap and trade, meaning that the GDP will not be a mutually exclusive indicator on the cap. And then with regards to expansion of the US-India dialogues, regarding climate change and economic sustainability, that's what we want our focus to be on. The U.S. will support the growth and development of our economy as it goes into fruition. And then regarding regulation on multinational companies within India, the U.S. companies say they will take responsibility economically for the processes that their companies exploit in India, specifically regarding emissions. And then we want to keep jobs in India, so we want to maintain that motto of Make in India. However, we want foreign companies within India, with Indian employees to remain so that jobs are readily available for our growing population. And then we support that transnational route with China and SAARC countries, so long as security regulations remain stringent and it will benefit India. So with further construction, we seek greater transparency from the Chinese government regarding knowledge and technology. I know that I mentioned it, but a prime minister 2 years ago was also talking to the president in China regarding this transparency in education. And then we will start investing in renewable energy in other SAARC countries, stipulation that India will get a reasonable percentage of the energy created. And that's it.
All right, hello, I'm representing the United States of America, and we have some amendments to our initial policies, new agenda. We do plan to prioritize humanitarian aid. There are a lot of developing countries, most of the SAARC nations, India, China, and we intend to give them money as they develop towards more sustainable practices and a developed economy. We also plan to increase FDI to improve foreign direct investment, that is, to improve the economies in those countries, which we agreed on, I think, with all the teams. We discussed an international cap and trade policy, which I think originated with SARC, where each nation would have a carbon cap, and it would be allotted in credits that could be bought and sold by countries to kind of disperse wealth from richer countries to poorer countries when the richer countries are more in need of those credits. We also talked about initiatives within the United States to improve our sustainability. We want to decrease our greenhouse gas emissions in order to be more on par with the world standard that we want to advocate. And the carbon cap by nation would go with the cap and trade policy. Specifically with each nation, we discussed with SARC that we want future dialogues to discuss environmental refugees, because so far that's been a major problem, a lot of environmental refugees coming from SARC countries. With India, we want to increase regulations with multinational corporations. India had mentioned in a few dialogues that we've been outsourcing a lot of companies here, and we're kind of using that to relieve the United States of their carbon emission burden, and we feel bad about that, and so we want to engage in dialogues to figure out how we can resolve some of those problems and take responsibility for our carbon emissions. With China, China wants us to improve our carbon emissions back home in the United States. So we plan to implement federal and local standards to tax carbon emissions, hydrofluorocarbons, and fossil fuels, such that the United States will become more renewable. Also with China, we plan to fully support their dam projects and sustainability projects within China, and we have agreed to their plan to assimilate 5% of our debt to renewable energies in the United States. That's $63.5 billion US. And lastly, with the UN, we're the only G7 country represented in this dialogue, and so we have agreed to discuss with other G7 countries what we can do to help this problem on a worldwide scale and aid developing countries, which goes with, we want to develop a timeline for specifically when, how much, and where we will be providing humanitarian aid. We also, I just want to clarify with the UN, they said something about discussing with us a solely per capita carbon cap with the cap and trade policy, and we did not explicitly agree to that. We wanted to continue to engage in dialogues about how that carbon cap would be determined, and we look forward to doing so. Thank you guys.
Okay. Okay, ready. All right, so yes, my name is Rachel and I'm representing SARC today, and we just wanted to have an emphasis on unity and just collaboration with what we'll be talking about today. So the first thing, why we are all here, is just trying to limit our CO2 emissions, and that was like the first main goal on our agenda that we really wanted to emphasize today. And one of the main ways that we wanted to do this was by emphasizing the Cancun Agreement, which has been discussed previously, but as we're having all these talks with the conference occurring in Paris in December, they align quite a bit with the Cancun Agreement. And the most important part of this is follow through. A lot of countries here have agreed with it, but there hasn't really been a lot of specific proposals brought forward to specify how we are going to stay below increasing the global temperature by 2 degrees Celsius. So we really also wanted to have UN enforcement with all of this, with all the countries involved. And the other thing that we wanted to do is encourage cap and trade method for CO2 emissions. And we were favoring per capita criteria, particularly just having all of the CO2 emissions on the planet and then dividing it on a per person basis, with there being a slight curve trend for those carbon credits. And that being specifically that with more developing countries, that they would have a little bit more leeway to have increased CO2 emissions, and with it becoming less so as they're more closer to being developed countries. And for international agreements, we had talked with a lot of the countries here, actually all of them, about funding sustainable research within the countries of SARC, just to be able to help lower our CO2 emissions and have stronger infrastructure. We had talked with the US and the UN specifically also about humanitarian aid, just with some of our countries being fragmented from war and, again, trying to improve infrastructure. We also talked about water treaties, especially with India and China, and with that we just want to have proper allocations of water, just for remembering that it is a shared resource,
And we also wanted to implement mutually beneficial dams. So we're in favor of building dams. We also just want to make sure that all parties that are involved, it doesn't harm the ecosystem in any one area, and that also there's a proper sharing of maybe the power that is made from the dams. We also wanted to have a railway expansion, the project that China had mentioned earlier. We wanted to have that actually extend in a way to Pakistan and Afghanistan, just to help with the infrastructure there and to help that economy there. And just to be able to help connect those areas in addition to Bangladesh like they had mentioned. And with all of these things, we hope that improving infrastructure will help us with the empowerment through education. So just allowing there to be greater education from the better infrastructure, both to help women, but also to help just our youths to have greater literacy rates. That's it. Thank you.
We would like to propose a system in which we have 3 weights on the international bi-nation carbon cap that's set, and kind of modeling after Congress in the United States, we'd like to propose 1 weight on a set number of carbon credits per country. So no matter the size of the country, they get this many carbon credits. A 2nd weight on the country's GDP, and a 3rd weight on the population of the country of per capita credit. And then we would like to discuss what you guys feel about this plan and how you might want this to be weighted.
Sark?
So, as SARC, we feel that the weighting system that you described, so per country is a needs-based system. Per capita is a rights-based system, the right for each person to emit. And per GDP is a status-based system, a status earned by countries progressing from being manufacturing high emissions countries to a level where they could be service countries. So we don't think the fact that they have already achieved service status should factor into the equation, allowing them to emit even more.
Any responses to start?
So, the UN would like to say that originally in our discussions across the nations, we found that there seemed to be a consensus that per capita was the established way to go. And what we spoke about was that if it seemed that a particular nation or region or however that is divided should lower their cap on how much they can emit, that the more developed nations should be helping to fund that change by providing capital for greener energy solutions. So if we're going to talk about looking at this, and weighting GDP and weighting other factors, I mean, I think in the end, it's all going to change the way we look at things, but we know that if we're going to try to reach a certain goal, we're going to need help from the developed countries to do that anyway.
Thank you, Thurston. China, do you have on that? Yeah.
So on behalf of Team China, I do think it's really important to look at the per capita emissions, especially in the context of the South Asian countries. With that being said, I think that there needs to be allowances made for emissions coming from countries that are manufacturing powers, such as us, because we are the largest manufacturing power in the world by far, and as such, there's going to be some resultant emissions, and I think that needs to be taken into account.
Is there anything from India?
We were in support for the per capita system, just because India being a developing country, it allows more people to have more of an ability to develop and more industries to develop within India. So it'd be really strengthening to also formalizing the informal sectors within India, giving people the rights to more energy, I guess you could say, in that regard. So I think India is more in favor for per capita, but also open to more discussion about GDP.
US?
So for the GDP, I think just looking at it as a status level is ignoring the world economy, because I think the GDP is going to take into the fact that the U.S. is such a big economic player in the world. So, and if that's not taken into account, I think our every economy is going to be affected by that if the U.S. economy isn't doing well. And also, again, we want to stress that we want to set these caps, but the U.S. also wants to fund.
We are giving the aid.
And we are giving the aid.
So, so we would ask, so the U.S. is the largest economy in the world. So why does the U.S., an economic powerhouse, need more emissions per person? So why do they need the ability to become even more economically powerful than they already are? Because that's what that gives you the ability to do.
See, we think we're basically working with a finite number of carbon resources here in order to meet that 2 degrees Celsius goal.
Right.
And we believe that were those finite resources to be distributed equally across the 7 billion people in the world, most of them would go to like China and India. And we think that, given the fact that we have like less than a quarter of the population of China, I think that would be catastrophic to the United States economy. And the United States economy right now is supporting so much of the world through humanitarian aid and even through just exporting goods.
And other countries don't have India does not have the infrastructure to support if our economy isn't doing as well, they don't have the infrastructure to support what would happen.
I don't think we're talking about taking resources. I don't think we're talking about giving additional resources to the United States.
Yeah.
I think were we to look at it per capita, we would be looking at taking away a huge number of resources from the United States.
But like you said,
India had a point.
Talking about the U.S. being such an economic powerhouse, unfortunately for the U.S., a lot of their industry is elsewhere in the world, putting the emissions on the backs of other countries. So looking at it from a per capita standpoint, an average U.S. citizen still has the highest emissions for per capita numbers out of any country in the world. And that definitely needs to go down considering main manufacturing isn't even done in the U.S.
I think what it seems like to me is that you're arguing that we have the highest emissions now, so to cut back would be a drastic change. So I feel like you're arguing more for a total emissions, total cap emissions, where you look at the total emissions for each country and then you set limits based on what you had in the past. I feel like by bringing out the amount of money that you make into by bringing out the total GDP, it's kind of emphasizing the wrong point. Does that make sense?
Time out. So I think the opportunity here is not to go rogue on state policy. So as negotiators for representing India or SAARC or US or China, you cannot go rogue on your government. That's not the opportunity. So if your government does not have a stated policy on XYZ, right, or never had that, will never have that, that's not what you can defend here. Okay, so that's not where we want this discussion to go. We'll talk about this. Let's take a break, and we'll have coffee anyway. So let's take a short break. So in 15 minutes. But meanwhile, I'd like to talk. The stakeholders would like to talk with SAARC and with Team US. Okay. I'd also like to take this opportunity to talk separately with all the others in terms of what their stakeholders might say. Okay. So a little bit of a short break, and I think if we tell her, then coffee might be here soon.
that's what cabin drinks for. Someone would give it to you. You give us money so we can help you do it. That's what cabin drink is.
Okay. So here is where we are heading onwards. So why are we, as the US, highlighting this issue of emissions per GDP? Where does this mandate come? This mandate is clear. Granted, there may be some least pushing this, but we don't care as the US government as of now is not clear. In fact, if anybody would care, it would be the extreme right range. And as of now, the extreme right range does not hold power. Even if the right were to hold power, the even if the Republican Party were to vote for the power, they probably won't get right. Nobody would say per GDP, emissions per GDP. We do need to gradually get the world to understanding that yes, the other points that we are making about, with the US needs to be. We're expecting the US to help, let's agree, to make it easier for us, for the negotiators here, and for our stakeholders, meaning our government, to go back and send it to the US people. And you will make it easier if you help in this, so don't make it such that it's completely per capita, which hurts us. How can you help? But emphasizing this GDP point, right, is taking it in a whole direction, which is a view that I understand exists here, but that's not the US view.
Okay, that's not necessarily our view.
So they express it.
Okay, but
because the discussion is completely getting hijacked.
I feel like the United States is prone to behaving this way in international
No. We've been telling everybody that we didn't want GDP to be a mutually exclusive factor. We just wanted it to be like somehow taken into.
No, but why? Why should GDP be a factor? We really bring GDP. All these discussions come. Of course, you are already placed high. You have historically done these things, and hence you deserve more. Doesn't take you anything, right, that the international community discusses. In fact, if anything, there is a discussion from the other side. Historically, these countries have committed more. Hence, responsibility to their things and to actually help others who have not done that, who are not so well connected to help them with technology to get. That is the discussion that happens internationally. If you think that internationally, the US says that, the zero, the US will never say that, because that will use their soft power, that will use the US soft power. I mean, but if you think that the US is the most, is the most strong militarily, why should we care? Well, that is working so well for us in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and everywhere else, right? And works so well. Yeah, that's not the point. What the US wants here is soft power, right? In addition to whatever else.
Yeah.
And the way to get that is not to emphasize we are already at this place, hence we want this. Why should the US do that? What is Europe doing? Europe also is, in terms of GDP or at least GDP per capita, Europe is fairly high. Many places in Europe are higher than that. They don't see that. They, in fact, say, yes, we're trying even more. We are the good guys. Europe wants to be the good guys. Right? Similarly, US, at least definitely when, let's say, the left, or within the US, the center left is in power, definitely there. But even if it's the center right which is in power, and it usually varies between those two camps in the fringe, right? They will not want to do that. So the idea here is to get this debate not be hijacked by that GDP. Say that yes, that was one thing we are saying. Now that you have said it, you cannot completely backtrack.
Yeah.
That's why we were doing
I know, but don't let it be hijacked. So now you have to say that yes, it is. We sort of mentioned it as one of the things that have come up. Within the US also, as you know, as in many other countries, not one US. As you know, there's multiple US, and even in the Kyoto thing, protocol, we couldn't send it for ratification because of our internal law. President, our current president, United Kingdom, wants to do XYZ, but we cannot do that. We have to have ratification from Senate, from citizens, etc. So more inclusive we make it within the US, the better it is. In that context, we just brought that up. Of course, that is not the issue that we are going to strike, but help us help. Let us understand what is the best way. If we just go back to our country and say per capita, right? Our administration and our president will like that better than just if you go back and say per GDP, because that's not what they want to say either. But reality is it will go anywhere far. Right? So they will like it in the sense that okay, as negotiated we tried, but it's something that will not go far. So help us. So okay, it's not GDP, okay, it's not. It cannot be just per capita, because then that would mean that we have to suddenly reduce X amount.
Yeah.
This is, we understand that in an equitable world, this kind of discussion may happen at some point, but this is not realistic. And remember what we do, ultimately we want to help. So how can we take the discussion on that direction, and the moment it is hijacked by this one, I know that part of it has been made in the arena. I say no, that's not really. Just draw that up as that could be one extreme view.
Yeah.
People have in our country there are lobbyists who have said that. In other developed nations there are people who have suggested that in that context to broad that view. Let us not make this whole thing being hijacked. We are here, all of us are gathered here as representatives of our stakeholders. We can move from that. However, we have also been selected for the greater good in the sense. Right? All of us want to, but you have to help us, help ourselves and help you. Take that conversation a bit and don't get too much stuck in that.
Yeah, that's what we were trying to do. Because everybody got stuck on the GDP.
That's what exactly.
But the fact that the conversation was started by, what do you think about GDP?
Yeah, I realized what they were doing.
Yeah, they will do that because that's something that will come as a shock to them. Each time, just take it and say, no, that is one thing you suggested because they're lobbyists. But that's not our stated position. We are not saying that is not what we do.
Like, I don't know if you're allowed to do this in this game, but like you just said that like switching like to strictly per capita would be like devastating. Like, what would you recommend?
No, he said that we're going to try to go to a consensus where we would try to do it per capita, but like try
But we
to
need
give
like a
us
transition
some
plan.
sort.
Yeah, so it's not a per capita wouldn't work for me.
Right.
It's not disaster is probably not the right term. It's unrealistic.
Right.
US is not going to let that happen. Like, suddenly become its per capita emissions suddenly becoming that of equal to that of China or India or Sub-Saharan Africa. But the issue is if you can, so what you're trying to convince here is that look, per capita we cannot convince. Yes, we can agree here that it's a good strategy. That's like saying, that's like mother with an apple pie. That's like saying, yes, everybody is equal, we all believe. However, we want to. So let us take it to a place where from where we can. It will not ever, in the current situation, in the next 100 years, it will never go to equal per capita. Right? Even if we cannot see the next 100 years, next 10, 20 years, it's not going to work. Let's get that straight. Let's be realistic. However, yes, we do understand that GDP thing we brought up because there are some lobbyists within our country who do say that. That's not what we want. Right? But we also brought that up to remind all of us here that there is that extreme view. And we may not want to cater to that extreme view, but we may want to cater to other people who will be seen as centrists within our countries, who will not go for the per capita.
Yeah.
So let's bring it to something which is that's gradually more than
Okay.
okay, so you want to huddle a little bit
Yeah.
in the university.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so as one of the largest stock democracies, we just want to clarify that as the U.S. we are representing a spectrum of viewpoints, which in this case does include extreme lobbyists who advocate for the inclusion of GDP in the emissions discussion. And so we'd like to move away from that discussion and talk about how you can help us help you. And as a result, we're open to a more per capita basis as we are, again, supportive of developing economies. And we'd also like to say that through outsourcing, we're not trying to transfer, quote, transfer emissions, but we're supporting economies through providing employment opportunities. And to continue in this thread, we'd like to facilitate positive discussion about how to help us help you, and we'd like to open up the floor to you to give us proposals for how to help. So,
Anyone like to say anything? Thank you, Amy.
So, as we possibly move towards a per capita structure, so we would assume that as SARC, we would be selling a lot of our emissions capita credits to the U.S. So we would hope that as you say that you would like to invest in our infrastructure, that you could invest directly into SARC's goal to create new renewable energy sources. Therefore, we could continue to give you more of our carbon credits because with such a low energy need right now, we could feasibly actually solve that with renewable energy, whereas a bigger country would have a hard time doing so.
Yeah, so we agreed to, as we agreed during negotiations, we agreed for your sustain program. Yeah.
Press release in the Atlantic. There is a whole spectrum of possibilities in between emissions per GDP and emissions per capita. And
Okay, so first I would like to clarify, as we've formally been notified, that the humanitarian amount allocated from the US is actually way smaller in comparison to their overall GDP. And I'm discussing this because I want to bring into light the fact that SARC, countries in SARC and India are prone to severe climate change and climate disasters, and there's no resiliency for this. And so I'm wondering if you guys would be willing to not just increase your funding for education or infrastructure, but also in methods of adaptation. For instance, Nepal being hit with that earthquake.
Right, so we earlier stated our support for environmental refugees in the SARC areas, which we recognize as a very big problem as the global climate changes. So, is that?
And we, like, in the first presentation, we did talk about, like, for examples like funding shelters, reforestation, and education and job programs for people displaced by climate change issues.
And it wasn't just directed towards the U.S. I just feel like I personally feel that we haven't discussed this issue as a collective group as much as I would have liked, yes.
So to a certain extent, that's kind of what we want to do with the cap and trade. So when developing countries have a surplus in the emissions allotted to them, they can then sell those to countries like the United States or the G7, and then they can use that money for sustainable practices or for adaptations.
Is there any response to this?
Okay.
Okay. So we want to sort of reiterate the goal of our negotiations is to remain under 2 degrees Celsius in terms of our total global warming or climate change issues. And so that's why we're saying that we need heavy investments and we need them soon. And we know that the developed nations have the power to invest in these renewable energy sources, but that the developing nations need to focus their resources on eradicating poverty because their citizens are currently vulnerable. So while we want that to be and recognize that it's important to keep those goals in mind for developed versus developing nations, we also need to remember that our overall goal is to stay under 2 degrees Celsius, and we need a framework for countries as well as scientific analysis to determine that after we follow those frameworks that we will stay under 2 degrees Celsius, because if not, it's going to be catastrophic and we want to avoid that. So we want each nation to both commit to having a framework and a plan for this. And we would also, in order to assure all nations of trust issues, get a commitment from all nations to allow the UN to perform inspections within every nation so that we can verify that each nation is being accurate with their reportings. Yeah, I think That's mainly what we want to say, because we want to keep citizens of the world safe, especially those who are most vulnerable now.
The statement, press release, the recent statement made by the United Nations team was widely applauded, especially by the left and center-left politicians across the board. Although there was some dissent among the right, who especially picked on the last part of the statement to decry what they perceived as interventionist UN policies. Not many people would agree with that characterization. It would be interesting to see how the moderator team now shepherds this discussion towards the summary policy document and then eventually towards the full document. The press is waiting. There was... Sark had something to say?
So we've been taking notes on all the similarities that have come up throughout today's discussion, and we're going to put those, project them on the screen, keeping in mind that we can all still discuss some of the differences that we may be having and have discussed over the coffee break. So do you want to put that up on the projector? And while we do that, has anything changed during the break? Anybody's opinions on any points that they've been talking about? No. Yeah, China.
Okay, so China as a nation is very interested in investing in the infrastructure and development of the developing countries in South Asia. However, to do so, we need capital. And a major issue in that front is that the U.S. is in debt to us about $1.27 trillion. So we want to work on developing a payment plan with the U.S. To get that back to us. And one incentive that we had planned for was to alleviate the U.S. of 5% of that debt on the condition that they would invest it in renewable energy technology, but we want to amend that and now say that we specifically want the U.S. to invest that 5% in solar energy technology, specifically the solar energy technology that is being developed in China, as we are one of the world's leaders on solar energy technology. So that's one change that we made.
Thank you. Can you just clarify that? So you originally allotted us $63.5 billion of our debt in a proposal that we would invest in sustainable energy in the United States of America, and we agreed to that proposal, and now you're amending it to strictly solar, and is that in China or in the United States?
Well, it's energy systems that can be used in the United States, but we would prefer that you receive the supplies and the technicians and engineers and employ people from China using that money that we are graciously taking away from your national debt.
We're selling our
people.
Is that what we're always doing?
Well, we're employing people.
So is that like putting 5% for foreign direct investments into China, right?
Essentially, yeah. Essentially, yes.
Okay, as you guys think about this shift in positions, we're going to begin going through the main points that we've discussed today.
The international press had just one short comment.
That's really like China.
And one of the points that we'll be discussing is
Let's get up in this right now.
Also, give us a dance.
I'm sorry.
Guys, sorry, all teams present today, I would like to steer the discussion to improving economy for China and India. There were a couple of things all the teams agreed on, or I found they agreed on, so let's move on to that.
I think
SARC.
people have been putting SARC into the discussion.
Yeah, so when it says China and India, the infrastructure and economy improvements were supposed to be for all of SARC, including India?
Yep, that's another discussion for including all of SARC, but we can include SARC in this too.
Yeah.
Because like those specific points that are on number 1 but not on number 3 have been related to SARC as well.
Which ones exactly?
Education, trade routes. It was education. It was education for all of them.
Yeah. Trade routes was big.
Okay.
Foreign direct investment.
Just add SARC to the /India.
Yeah, it was literally everything on there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want to amend this though.
Yep. Amendments.
Can I just make a statement from China?
Yep.
All right, so if we're talking about improving the economy of China, India, and SARC, I'd like to bring up this reduction in the Gini coefficient. We want to improve income inequality, and a method by doing that is improving education for women. We had some discussion about it before. What we were trying to say is China is trying to put in our funds, our guidance, our resources into bringing up South Asia. We're using education in women as an investment into decreasing population, making a smaller strain on natural resources. So instead of having this separate bullet point, I think this kind of goes into the same umbrella as in reducing inequality in our region in its entirety. So I also think I want to just make that statement, blanket statement about what we mean by education for women in general.
So just to clarify, are you saying that you want education for women to be its own number, or
I think like a sub like a sub point of it.
So like
through education
reducing inequality, and a way to do that is by educating women, because as China, we don't have a disparity between how men and women are getting educated. Our youth literacy is 100% for both males and females. So we're trying to get everyone to be on board with what we've already implemented.
I think, and in terms of like specific programs that you're interested in investing in, how are you interested in going about that? Is it a governmental shift, or is it investing in NGOs? And could you sort of elaborate on your plan? Because I know this is something you guys have discussed.
We want to help produce some legislation, so yeah, government, about a compulsory education program and allotting more women into a higher education system.
Right, so I think this might be better represented on here if it just said educational reform, and one feature of that will be trying to get women into higher education using quotas.
All right, Xinhua reports that the government of China is very happy with the Chinese negotiation team. And incidentally, the old environmental minister has come back from his family obligations and assumed his role all over again.
I thought he was executed. I don't know. He's a zombie.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, and is everybody on board with this? Yeah.
I don't know if we discussed specifically quotas, because they seem to be kind of not the best method for determining things in education. So I think we should discuss that in a little bit more detail and exactly how that will be implemented.
I think that as a moderator, we're going to have to stress that although this is a pertinent discussion, we feel that we should keep the discussions about quotas or about gender equality relevant to this topic and relevant to climate change. So keep that in mind when you discuss quotas. Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you meant China. Anyway, I respectfully disagree with the moderating team. Education is directly impacts climate change. We had a graph before on India, how increased education in women limits fertility rates, which limits the stress on the economy, on natural resources, on hazards, on emissions, and many other things that contribute to climate change. So to say that this doesn't pertain to our conversation, I think is incorrect. I think we should keep it there, personally.
Is China willing to adopt any other measures to reduce the Gini coefficient of South Asia, other than educational reform? Or should we move on to trade routes?
I think we should move on.
Yeah.
We're done with this.
Are all teams in agreement?
Sark, are you in agreement?
We can, and wait, to add, to go off of, I'm sorry about Sark, we can modify the conversation to talk about recruitment opportunities, talk about getting, I guess,
I think it's more
we
of
can
like a
remove
specific
quotas.
thing that we're worried about. So
We can
move
remove
on,
quotas
and
in
then
situation,
we
but
can move on.
as long as we have approval on the general reform that we're trying to do, then we can talk about wording another time.
That's fair.
Okay, as with last time, the goal is to get consensus, so if there are any groups who disagree, we will now move on.
Yep. Trade routes. China and India and SAARC in general have been linked by an ancient trade route called the Silk Route. So now we move on to the modern context. What would all the teams agree on? Would you like to agree on a free trade agreement, perhaps?
Yes. Agree.
Okay.
No, SAARC mentioned something called the SAFTA. So just pointing it out.
Sark, would you like to?
No, it's already.
Okay, so we're mostly interested in a Trans-Asian Railroad. We didn't really talk about free trade agreements, and so we can talk about that, but we haven't really put that on the table.
Yeah, we agree with Sark. We are really huge proponents of the Trans-Asian Railroad, and that's really what we were kind of talking about when we were talking about trade routes.
With the Trans-Asian Railroad, you do have to have a discussion though about trade, because that is what it is made for.
I think India would support free trade within South Asia. I don't know what you guys have to.
So the Trans-Asian Railroad should pass through India?
Yes.
Is that what you're advocating?
Yes, we already talked about a high-speed rail that's going to connect 3 Indian cities as well.
Yeah, but we need to, I think we need to have the conversation about actual trade agreements as well, not just the infrastructure.
As of yet, we haven't talked about free trade in its entirety, so we can bring it up now.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Yeah,
and that's why I'm bringing it up,
so
that's
let's
why I'm
talk
bringing it
about-
up now.
Okay, so China, do you have an opinion on free trade within the Trans-Asian Railroad trade routes?
We're gonna, can we discuss a little bit?
Okay, would you guys like a few minutes to deliberate within your groups?
Yes, please.
Okay, thanks. Deliberate, we'll come back in like 3 minutes.
What is your
Just China's doing
What's the
We have a question, President Williams. We have a question.
What's your position?
We're not sure.
No free trade. Everybody has to get $60. We'll shoot you. We have the military. What are you gonna do? I can kill you.
We're not really always going to open up that relationship. So let's have
USA, do you have something to say? We haven't heard from USA in a little while. Would you like to,
Sorry?
USA.
Oh, free trade?
Oh.
Sorry, we have a response to China's budget plan, but we can discuss this later after the free trade, if that's better.
Yes. Cool.
Going back to the free trade thing, China is definitely open to free trade within Southeast Asia. So, well, South Asia, sorry, South Asia, not just Southeast, South Asia. Just in general, just South Asia. Sorry.
Yeah, we think it can be a very mutually beneficial initiative for us and the rest of South Asia.
Specify free trade in South Asia.
In South Asia.
Just South
Strictly in South Asia.
Are you in support of an agreement of free trade in general on principle?
We will consider, we are open to discussion.
We're open to discussion about the details of what we're trading.
But we're.
Depends
So we're open to discussions in general, but we are definitely open to free trade in South Asia.
You did a good job too.
Alright, the moderating team would like to remind people to keep side conversations to a minimum. Sorry?
We don't think that this particular occasion is the time to talk about free trade in South Asia, so we would like to oppose that issue at this time.
We also think that it's an incredibly, there's so many different diverse economies within SARC, and we haven't had enough time to really delve into what each one would agree or disagree between all the different countries in this region. So at this moment, we don't support it fully.
Alright, so moving on to the next point then. Thank you, sorry. United States, increasing foreign direct investment. Would you, United States, like to clarify and discuss China's budget plan a little bit more in depth, as you were saying?
Yeah, so our response to China's budget plan is we are definitely open to paying back our debts to China, and we thank them for lending the money when we needed capital. However, we do agree with the 5% to invest in research in solar energy. However, we feel that we would be more open if this 5% was put into collaborations with the US and China in developing solar energy and solar panels. So essentially, we would like to use the 5% to increase collaboration between US and China in developing mitigation and adaptation technologies, research, development for climate change.
And what about FDIs beyond 5%? Because that only pertains to investment within China.
I think that was a separate issue from the debt we owe them.
Yep, please direct your statements to only your FDI, not your debt repayment. That's a different point.
They were just inquiring about our debt and
Yeah.
how we could pay that back.
Is this later on?
Yeah, debt repayment is later on.
Sorry, we apologize, that was confusion.
Yes. FDI in South Asia, do you support increasing FDI in South Asia in general or only in China or certain areas?
In general, in developing countries in South Asia.
Okay.
Yes.
And is everyone in support of US increasing its investment in South Asia?
Yes.
Yes.
Moving on to the next point. Practices of US multinational companies in these countries. A check or a regulator for these companies and their activities.
One interruption, sorry. B2, free trade in South Asia.
Yep.
So you wrote that in red, that means it's been approved or it's not been approved?
Not been approved.
Go ahead, sir.
Would the UN like to comment? Checking practices of US companies, exploitation of labor, etc.
And just for that point, as a moderating team, we would like to know what specifically checking practices would mean and which bodies would be checking the practices with the government or the United Nations. So if anybody could offer a more specific.
Okay. The UN would like to say that in terms of checking practices for the United States multinational corporations, we would be open to offering our support or
Our inspection.
to being the inspected body.
I think I would add that to China approved D.
Just do simple.
I'm going.
Do you have to respond? We also for the UN inspection.
Same. Sorry. We're good.
Alright, does anybody contend that point?
I mean,
If not,
yeah, on to the next one.
Yeah, they already agreed.
Yeah, they already agreed that we could put 5% towards renewables in the US, they took back that.
This is the time when you can, go back on your agreements. That's why these negotiations are for.
Yeah.
You could go back based on stakeholder input. You could go back. And explain why you're doing this. Once these are set in stone, they are set in stone. These are not set in stone yet. This is the time to apologize and leave and go back. Or ask
again, just to make this move more smoothly, we do encourage you to keep sort of respect for the whole general discussions, and if you need to discuss with your group, try to pass notes with each other. That'll help everybody understand what's going on. So, are we, as a consensus, as this body, are we okay with point B? US?
We've just received message from our stakeholders, especially in the private industry, which funds a lot of the US budget, that we are now perhaps more open to negotiations with the checking of practice of US MNCs, more especially maybe perhaps. Yeah, we don't explicitly approve it.
So do you explicitly not approve it?
Yeah, we don't approve.
We do not approve 1D.
Yeah.
Naked, we do not approve 1D.
D.
Yeah, that's why it's
D1. Yeah.
Well,
Ready?
yeah, that is titled no.
Yeah.
D. Yeah.
Wait, they don't want their practices to be checked?
No, because they like explicitly,
Alright, so moving on, point number 2, United States will decrease emissions. Does anybody besides the United States have any opposition to that? Okay, no. United States, do you agree with that point?
Yeah, so bring it up in the national government and like policies of that. Yes.
and we already have goals in place about reducing emissions.
Alright, perfect. Next point, China will implement local plans to tax carbon emissions.
Yep.
We're already doing that. I think what the point was that we wanted the US to also implement local plans to tax.
So, yeah, you have to revise it.
So the US will,
China wants.
because we're already doing that. We already have plans to tax carbon emissions, so it's not a will, it's a when.
Okay.
United States, any response to that?
To B. Is there any opposition to carbon taxing?
To be.
Not as of the moment.
Alright. Thank you, United.
Alright, here we go.
Carbon cap.
Moving on to the carbon cap. Okay, does the United Nations have a comment about B?
Hang on, wait.
Be red.
No, about
Can you
Wait.
decide once?
B should be red.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can we ask why?
Can you?
Because they didn't approve.
I mean, we said why you went from approval to disapproval?
Not at this moment, because we're currently working on our current regulations and policies and put those in place. And then if those perhaps still do not work and do not comply with the carbon emissions, then we will look into doing that.
Moving on to the carbon cap, which has been a hotly contested topic. Who would like to go first?
I just.
Okay. Sark.
So we just want to specify that SARC will only support a per capita carbon cap, and we support that, as we discussed with the United Nations. I believe there's some mention of that.
India would also agree.
Is there any opposition to a per capita carbon cap?
A purely per
Yeah,
capita, yes.
Yeah, we would like to vote nay for pre-discussed reasons and not discuss them.
We need to
United Nations.
The UN would like to clarify the point of negotiation that is to see that it will not be purely, that we do not support a purely per capita or GDP, and that we recognize that that is not going to be the solution.
The United Nations recognizes the fact that for these negotiations to work, we need the support of countries such as the United States, and we know that there's no way that having a solely per capita cap is going to, like the United States will not involve themselves if that is the case, and so we recognize that another metric, not per GDP, but another metric may need to be involved in the considerations for what the cap will be for each country. But taking that into consideration, if another metric is added that is more favorable to the United States, we think that in turn the United States should have more of a responsibility to help out countries such as SAARC and India in reducing their emissions, because we're adding something that is more favorable to them.
And to say we aren't necessarily specifying at this time exactly what that metric will be, but we can propose metrics such as looking into how developed the country is, or looking into how much of the country's economy produces carbon outputs, and other such factors that will be more fair to all parties rather than something that highly favors and in a way restricts any other individual country.
New York Times reports recent research which is yet to be published, but New York Times got wind of this research which is being carried out at Northeastern University by Professors Daisy Bressler and Kara Morgan about how different kinds of metrics which are suitable for measuring sustainable development and balancing that with GDP and carbon emissions may be able to work, however that's still in a research stage.
Thank you, New York Times.
We just wanted to make a couple comments. One being that with the whole per capita like carbon cap, we wanted there to be somewhat of a curve, just in terms of not making it a pure per capita sort of thing, but for emissions, making it be based upon how developed, like close to being in a developed country or not, countries are, and like how they are arranged. And we also wanted to politely say that we think that the United Nations should please try to represent all countries present here and what they're favored for, and not just the one country that's opposed to it.
As the United Nations, we're taking into consideration that we do have to represent all countries, and the point is to come to an agreement that's mutually beneficial to everybody involved, and just as a per GDP basis is not beneficial to any of the developing nations, a per capita basis is not beneficial to the developed nations. And so that's what we're trying to take into consideration when we look at this situation. And that's why we're realizing that it's not totally feasible to do solely per capita sliding scale based on how developed a nation is, because all of the nations in the G7 who are really big players in the situation also need to be represented.
Oh, sorry.
So we would like to point out that during
Keep going.
Yeah. Okay. During the last debate, sort of, that we had with the United States, it came sort of towards like a conclusion, not a conclusion, but we reached the idea that what they were afraid of is that nations that are not as developed as the United States would have an excess of carbon credits that they would not have, they wouldn't have the infrastructure to actually use, and they would actually need the carbon credits so that their economy was not hindered. But that's kind of the point. It's not just a cap, it's a cap and trade system. So the influx of capital would really help developing countries. And then if they're not at the level where they need to emit that much, then the United States can easily buy their excess.
So are you proposing a hybrid per capita metric carbon cap and trade system?
Yeah, yeah. It's like, or it's a hybrid. It's just cap and trade, carbon cap and trade with a bit of a curve based on development.
United States, do you have any response?
Stakeholders in the United, or because of our stakeholders, U.S. negotiators are just stating that we would like to continue talks in the future, but for now, we are just disapproving this.
Okay. On that point, I believe we have to move on.
Develop, okay.
So the UN would like to ask that all countries would agree to allowing UN inspectors to ensure that the emission levels are as countries had approved, had said they would be, to help address the issue of mistrust between countries. Not enforcement, emission inspection.
Quick timeout, just for to ask